First of all, I wanted to ask you, I've seen that you've done a lot of work in energy law, environmental awareness, trade law, but recently you've seemed to have focus on human rights and human rights law. So how did you get started there, and what happened so that you had undergone such a shift in terms of the work you do?
Thank you. So just to place it into context, in South Africa, I'm more of a commercial South African attorney in private practice. Later on, I did do some specialization work at university level in terms of postgraduate in environmental energy and mining. However, the shift has always been, or the concern has always been, on occupied Palestine. And I think throughout my university life and even before that.
First of all, another question, which is somewhat intriguing to many of us who aren't South African, who look at what South Africa is doing and just wonder for a bit. South Africa was the initiator of the lawsuit in the ICJ against Israel. And although one may understand from afar, like that South Africa has had to deal with apartheid itself, and so this it may see itself as a nation that has to be at the forefront of dealing with other apartheid systems, but we don't really grasp the depth of what South Africa is doing, or why, particularly why it's doing this. As you see, many Arab and Muslim nations haven't done a lot in terms of support for Palestine, basically just making statements of solidarity rather than doing anything else concrete. And then you have a country that is thousands of kilometers away, just spearheading the legal fight against the Israeli genocide. Why? Why is South Africa doing all of this?
So I think that is a question that a lot of people, as you've mentioned, from overseas are intrigued by. I've also, in the early part of this year, was invited to Tehran by the Iranian Red Crescent Society, and I was also asked similar questions. I was invited to speak at many different seminars and conferences, particularly on South Africa's, intervention at the International Court of Justice. But to put this into perspective, Kareem, prior to South Africa even going to the International Court of Justice, South Africa, in fact, made a referral to the International Criminal Court. And a lot of people are unaware of this. So preceding the initial application and arguments that were heard at the ICJ, sometime in late November, South Africa, as I mentioned earlier, is a party to the Rome Statute and had domesticated the Rome Statute in terms of the implementation of the International Criminal Court Act that includes the Rome Statute in it. Is that it is then obliged in terms of its international obligations to ensure that egregious crimes such as war crimes, crimes of aggression, crimes of genocide, ethnic cleansing, torture, and other crimes that the perpetrators of this kind of these particular sui generis crimes are held accountable, and that South Africa would have international as well as national obligations in ensuring that, because it is a party to the Rome Statute and it has domesticated the law, that it takes its position in the world in relation to multilateralism, in position to upholding the rule of law, international law, and international humanitarian law. So already a referral was made in November 2023, latter part of November, it could be December, to the International Criminal Court. There were other countries that supported that application, and particularly in asking and requesting that an investigation be opened by the International Criminal Court into alleged egregious crimes that have been perpetrated by the Zionist entity. Already, we know that the ICC has come under challenge about jurisdiction and whether Palestine is a state party for purposes of jurisdiction in terms of investigation by the ICC. This was a decision that was already made by the ICC, going back in terms of the Palestinian Authority that requested this, that recognition of jurisdiction. And it still surprises me that they've only asked to go back to 2014, which was the Operation Protective Edge War in Gaza that unfolded during the June-July period. In fact, they should have went back all the way to 2008, 2009, the first war, when initial horrendous crimes were being perpetrated. Of course, we know that Gaza is under collective punishment, under blockade, under siege, and enduring the worst kind of humanitarian catastrophe and suffering preceding the genocide that is now unfolding. So in that context, the ICC has already made a decision to investigate war crimes and so forth. And South Africa was party to that because we came out of a history of apartheid. Apartheid is an egregious crime. It's a crime against humanity. It's actually a proscribed crime in the Rome Statute. And with our particularly own set of circumstances of hundreds of years of colonization and experiencing colonization, colonialism, and then institutionalized apartheid from 1945 and onwards, when the Nationalist Party came into power. South Africans of black origin, which would include people like myself of Indian origin, were third-class citizens and were intently discriminated against when it came to white people in this country. And that was an enduring, systemic operation of an institutionalized campaign based on the color of and racial superiority of one creed of humanity over another. And this is exactly the similarity of what's going on in occupied Palestine, where Palestinians are third-class citizens, not recognized as human enough to, based on the policies, the racist ideological policies of Zionism that distinguishes between Jewish and non-Jewish origins, and ethnocracy. And this government of Israel, or the state of Israel, is a highly ethnocratic, fascist, racist, discriminatory, product that we've seen over many years from the Nakba to now, that is now actually culminating in the actual extinction of the Palestinian population. So South Africa, having looked at that obligations in terms of its own history of apartheid and so forth, that it had to take the front, it had to be the leader in invoking the Genocide Convention, because the facts are that Israel has been violating the Genocide Convention. If you look at the Genocide Convention, it speaks about a number of elements. It speaks to the destruction of a civilian population, affecting its civil reproduction systems. It talks about its, affecting its health situation, where medical clinics, hospitals are being targeted, and a direct attack on at the societal level to actually disintegrate that civilian society or Palestinian population. And that is part and parcel of the Genocide Convention, that Israel was a perpetrator of this genocide, that it was being aided and abetted and fully prosecuted by Western nations. Of course, its greatest ally, the United States, that was supplying it arms, supplying it weapons of war. There was a very interesting piece that came out very recently by a United Nations Special Committee saying that Israel's warfare methods were similar, right, to genocide. So its warfare methods, its architecture was genocidal in nature. South Africa made an important argument of genocidal intent. It spoke about Amalek and how Amalek by the Jewish population is being considered that Palestinians are the Amalek of today's time, and that they must be actually annihilated, they must be liquidated. So South Africa had that obligation, and we can go into those obligations at the International Court of Justice. In fact, it didn't only go once, it made several applications to the International Court of Justice and sought urgent interim provisional measures. Now, in terms of the international legal domain, where does the International Court of Justice sit? It sits as the hierarchy court, as the highest court body of the UN, of the multilateral system of nations, whereby judgments or not only advisory opinions, but provisional measures are obligatory upon state parties to abide with those obligations, with those provisional measures, which meant that you must ensure that there was humanitarian aid in access. You must provide humanitarian aid, to scale in Gaza. Certain requirements need to be fulfilled. And we saw that those provisional orders were not being abided by Israel because it was being vetoed by the UN Security Council by its greatest ally, the US. And this is the duplicity, this is the hypocrisy in the international legal system, that the international legal system is there to protect and prevent exactly this kind of situation that is unfolding in Gaza or other places where there's gross violations of humanitarian law and international law, and that to bring regional peace and stability and order back, that these bodies must be functional to be able to operate and police the system. And that is where South Africa fits in, to say we're using the multilateral system, we're using the instruments of law that we have signed and ratified. We are a party to the Rome Statute when it comes to the International Criminal Court. We are signatory to the Genocide Convention. So that means that we have an obligation to prevent genocide. And as a state party, if we see another state party perpetrating genocide, then we have the obligation to prevent the perpetration of that genocide and seek the necessary relief from the court, in this instance, the International Court of Justice. Of course, this has been framed within the perspective of South Africa's historical past. And this is something I've heard a lot of times about. Arab countries have not taken the lead. And this is disgraceful, to be quite honest. It's disgraceful that Arab countries have saw their brothers and sisters being slaughtered in occupied Palestine and have refused to do anything constructive. As you've mentioned, they've only had summit after summit and had talks after talks that have culminated in nothing productive in terms of constructive intervention. We should have been having Arab armies at the borders or in Gaza to prevent another child being slaughtered, to prevent another woman's dignity being detained, right? So they haven't performed. Countries like Jordan, Egypt have not performed because these countries have also been neutralized. And unfortunately, we're seeing the same situation unfold now in Syria. Just last night, I watched on the news coverage that over 400 Syrian installations, military buildings, have been targeted, okay? By who? By the Zionist entity. IDF forces, in terms of aerial bombardments and targeting, have targeted over 400 military bases, military buildings and targets. And this new regime that has come in, that's now talking about, the liberation of Syria, has not done anything to protect any of those bases. So the idea is very clear that even there, you're going to have a situation of the neutralization of Syria. And that plays into the hands of the Zionist entity in terms of their greater, what they call the Israeli project. Now, coming back to your question about South Africa had this historical obligation, and not only a historical, but also a present and current obligation. But it's not all that great that people are seeing South Africa in the context of what it is doing internationally. Kareem, I've just spoken earlier about some of the work that I've been doing as a lawfare advocate, predominantly in holding war criminals, particularly Zionist war criminals, accountable for crimes committed with impunity. And one of the projects is just behind me, which is called the South African Zionist Terrorism Corridor Probe, is where we actually expose the Zionist entities, these agencies, these organizations that are involved in mass-scale global terrorism, in a network of global terrorism. The fact that
Well, actually, I ask you about the probe, but first, I just wanted to ask a question related to the ICJ. So,
Sure.
as you said, the provisionary measures were not abided by. What recourses does the ICJ have other than the Security Council to achieve some sort of, to at least enact some pressure on the Israelis, apart from diplomatic pressure or legal pressure?
Yes. So I would say that this is something that people have been asking as well quite regularly, is that what do we do? Because the ICJ has given these provisional measures. We know that the ICJ had given even what you call advisory opinions on the wall in 2004,
Exactly.
and said that that was an apartheid wall, it was a discriminatory wall, and it actually impeded on Palestinian land and in terms of the 67 borders that needed to be recognized and adhered to. And the fact that Israel has come out very clear now that it's not interested in the recognition of the 67 borders, it's not interested in Palestinian occupied territories for a contiguous, sustainable economic state for Palestine to coexist, because Israel will always exercise its control and power over Palestine. Palestine will not have any army, it will not have any military, it will always be reliant economically on Israel as the occupier. So those facts have emerged, right? The fact that the question that you are asking is that when you have these provisional measures that came out of the ICJ, all state parties to the Genocide Convention become obligated to uphold the provisional measures that the ICJ has issued. Now, what does that mean? It means that there are two levels, two tiers, or even three tiers at which this can be abided by. On the first tier, it means that the UN Security Council has to convene, which happened on several occasions. And the Security Council ought to have passed a very strong resolution in favor of the ICJ provisional measures and ensuring that there would be enforcement of those ICJ measures. Unfortunately, the Zionist entity's greatest ally has blocked and vetoed any constructive measures that it could be undertaken at the UN Security Council level. But this doesn't negate countries at domestic level to do what it can in its own power in terms of ensuring that those provisional measures are adhered to. Why couldn't certain countries that are party to the Genocide Convention convene their armies, their military, to ensure that, look, if the if the UN Security Council is not doing it, we are based on ICJ, based on our signatories to the Genocide Convention, and based on the adherence to international law and international humanitarian law. Why can't we impose a oversight regional army in the area to stop what the IDF has been doing? That could have been one measure. Why didn't we have or see Arab armies or Arab countries create safe humanitarian corridors to ensure that humanitarian aid gets access into Gaza and that civilian populations are protected? They didn't need to have the UN Security Council pass a resolution for that. They could have been informed already by the ICJ and the provisional measures that were ordered to say that we are going to now enforce those orders, because at the level of the UN Security Council, it's not happening. Furthermore, these countries could isolate Israel in terms of an institutionalized boycotts, divestment, sanctions campaign, could create a regional court to say that any Zionist war criminal entering any of these countries in the area, we shall convene a tribunal, a war tribunal, and we will arrest these individuals and we will prosecute these individuals. even if it did not happen in reality, the fact that there was this symbolic or this move towards this kind of cooperation to say we'll form a regional war tribunal to hold these Zionists accountable. It would have been not just something that was done arbitrarily, but it would have been informed by the ICJ and the ICJ orders that were granted. For me, the important aspect was that many countries failed. In fact, all countries failed in this regard to physically ensure that our brothers and sisters, our Muslim brothers and sisters, were not protected at that level in terms of enforcement of the ICJ orders. Now, we obviously got to differentiate between that and what has been unfolding in terms of resistance. And I think that's an important question because the West, the Americans, the Europeans have always been playing this to the Zionist tune that Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, or Quds Brigade, whoever it may be, are all terrorists. They're all terrorists. So the moment they label a certain force a terrorist group, they can be isolated and they can be liquidated. And it sort of has given this justification for this kind of collective punishment that Israel has undertaken, which is clearly a war crime because even if they're fighting enemy combatants or they're fighting the resistance, they have failed to distinguish between distinction and proportionality between combatants and civilian population. The world has also failed to protect the civilian population in this regard. So this narrative, this terrorism narrative, is something very important that we have undertaken in 2022, whereby we started beginning to change the narrative of resistance being considered terrorism. In fact, all these countries and leaders that recognize Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and the ANC, the former ANC that brought liberation to this country, they were all considered terrorists, like Gaddafi, like the Yasser Arafat. They were all terrorists, and only after the change.
At imposing sanctions, but it's terrible at removing sanctions.
Yes. Sorry, Karim, you're breaking up there. I didn't hear that.
No, I said it's like many say. The United States is good at imposing sanctions, at labeling people terrorists, but it's horrible at removing sanctions and at removing these labels. So that's that it's only natural that considering the United States' heavy-handed approach. I mean, Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist until a few years before he passed away. It's dumbfounding.
Yes, indeed, indeed it is, and that has been our challenge. Is that we've wanted to start changing the narrative to actually show the terrorists for who they really are. The global state terrorism network in terms of the Jewish National Fund, in terms of the facilitation, the procurement, facilitation and processing of young Zionist impressionable Jewish youth from South Africa and many other countries that go and replenish the IDF and serve in the IDF, either as lone soldiers in terms of an Aliyah program whereby they go and are promised to study at Israeli universities, are given accommodation and other benefits, but then need to be conscripted into the IDF. And that is one of the elements in terms of the Zionist terrorism corridor probe that we expose, whereby we focus on a number of institutions, at least 4 South African institutions that have a global network of a Zionist footprint, including young Zionist Jewish impressionable youth that go to serve in the IDF. For instance, you are quite aware that on 21st November 2023, 2 Lebanese journalists, Rabi al-Ma'amari and Farah Umar, right?
Our colleagues.
Along with their driver,
our colleagues.
Excuse me?
Our colleagues at Mayadeen.
Yes, right. Along with their driver, Hussein Akil, were killed and targeted in an Israeli strike in the southern Lebanese town of Deir, Harfa, 2.3 kilometers, where Issam Abdullah was killed. The journalists were reporting for Al Mayadeen TV, and this is in our executive summary. a Lebanon-based Arab television station, and were clearly marked as press journalists in the area when there was clearly no combatants or fighters nearby. And importantly, we've got an eighth suspect in our criminal complaint, a certain Yaron Eisenberg, a light machine gunner from the Shananim Brigade, Miriam, in Facebook post dated 15 October 2023 and 20 October 23, respectively admitted that he and his military unit were stationed at the Lebanon border and were working around the clock on the northern border. So in this specific targeting of Al-Mayadeen colleagues, of the Al-Mayadeen colleagues and journalists who were clearly marked as journalists, and unfortunately, journalists have been the prime target of Israel's weaponization of the media in the targeting so that the news does not go out. We've heard about Shireen Abu Akleh as well, that hundreds of journalists have been killed in Gaza, and medical workers and first responders have been targeted. UNRWA workers from the United Nations have been targeted. This goes all against the international humanitarian law. You're not allowing the truth to be exposed. And in fact, the possibility is that this particular complainant that we have cited in our complaint for investigation could well have been part of this brigade called the Shanam Brigade that may have been involved in even the targeting of our colleagues or your colleagues in the Mayadeen television station. So this gives you the extent of the criminal complaint where we've not only focused it on Gaza, but we've also looked at activities on the northern occupied Palestinian border with southern Lebanon. We've also looked at the unlawful targeting of Fuad Shukran in Beirut. We've looked at the unlawful targeting of Ismail Haniya in Tehran. These are all acts of terrorism. We've seen the same thing when the Americans had targeted General Qasem Soleimani in Iraq on his way from the airport. So why is this not constituting terrorism? And that is exactly the narrative that our work, yes, and this is exactly the narrative that we're trying to do in terms of the team that I represent and the complainants I represent, is that to say, yes, South Africa at international level has now exposed the genocide complaint. For many years, we've been writing to our authorities and exposing war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, the persecution and torture of Palestinian prisoners in the West Bank, the forcible transfer and displacement of Palestinians from the occupied territories into Israeli prisons, which actually goes against the Geneva Conventions. The forcible displacement of a civilian population and collective punishment is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. So we're saying, I mean, what is the difference between what Hamas did in terms of the hostage taking on October 7th, which obviously had a basis, a context behind it. And if you look at American media, the US media, if you look at the Zionists, for them, everything started on October the 8th when hostages were taken by Hamas, and in return that, all hell was going to break loose in Gaza. And I know I wrote an article about 10 days later, Kareem. It's called The Unfolding Holocaust in Gaza. And some people said, but is this not too extreme? And I said, but look, all the indicators are there. About 5 or 6, not too long after Israel invaded or Israel came back into Gaza, in terms of the war that they've unleashed, the aggression. And I said that this is now the Holocaust that's going to unfold in Gaza, which in fact has happened because we've been seeing these indicators of an ultra-right, ethnocratic, ultra-nationalist, fascist regime. And we've seen this in the occupied Palestinian territories where certain of the Knesset members have been carrying out these pogroms against Palestinians in their homelands and in their properties. And this happened in the Al-Hurwa district by Smotrich, where one Palestinian was killed there. But we've been seeing the creation of these pogroms. We've been seeing this racist genocidal intent unfolding. So when this happened with the October 7th operation, which was actually an armed resistance operation, we make a very strong argument and we rely on international law as well as the international law and resolutions, international resolutions that speak about the right to armed struggle. Like South Africa had undertaken armed struggle. Armed struggle is closely associated to the right to self-determination. And that's what Palestinians are fighting for, is the right to self-determination and the taking of arms. And that can never constitute terrorism. Now, when you look at for instance, the hostage taking, right? In that instance, what makes it so different when Zionists in the occupied Palestinian territories have been taking Palestinian children? Yes, when Palestinian children are being detained and persecuted and tortured and are taken for months on end, and their parents don't even know where the children have been, and are unlawfully detained, and then after a certain period of time are re-detained. There are forced confessions. There's failure to take of any legal representation, and we've seen the horrendous crimes that are being committed of torture, which is a crime against humanity against Palestinians in prisons. That there was an idea of a hostage taking for a prisoner swap. And that was the context that, the West and the Zionists failed to inform the global media about, inform the global opinion about why Hamas's strategy was about hostage taking, because that was intended for a prisoner swap for many, many prisoners that are incarcerated and languishing in Israeli prisons and are being experiencing the worst kinds of torture. In
Yes.
fact, in 2016, I was invited to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Particularly, I was invited by the Khiam Rehabilitation Center. And on behalf of an organization called the Diamond, I went to Geneva in 2016. At the Human Rights Council, I made a submission regarding the treatment of Palestinian prisoners, the processing of Palestinian prisoners, the violations of international humanitarian law when the prisoners were being violated and displaced or transferred, were being transferred, forcibly transferred from Palestinian occupied territory into Israeli prisons, and how Israeli prison services were treating Palestinians. Also, how Palestinian youth were being incarcerated or under home confinement or house arrest. They couldn't go to school, they couldn't have friends, they couldn't have any social media. And all this was actually, the stripping away of their rights, of their fundamental human rights. Apart from the rights to freedom of association, the right to trade, the right to the right to movement, and so forth, which are all restricted in the occupied territories. So, coming back to your question that of the ICJ and what the ICJ meant, it meant that countries could also, with the kind of situation that was unfolding, can take independent measures outside of the United Nations or collectively with other like-minded countries in holding Israel to account for the crimes that have been committed
Exactly.
as well.
If any country, sorry to cut you off there, but if, and technically then, if any country chooses not to abide by the Rome Statute, then nothing can be done.
Yes, I mean, that's the thing. If a country does not want to abide with the Rome Statute, either a country has not signed the Rome Statute or does not want to abide by the Rome Statute, does not negate the fact that other countries that have been signatory to the Rome Statute and domesticated the International Criminal Court Act into their own law, that they could exercise those measures, right, within their own country. So, for instance,
If Netanyahu decides to travel to Germany, and Germany intentionally and with complete premeditation decides not to arrest Netanyahu on account of his political closeness to Germany, can anything be done against Germany?
well, so I think this comes down to the duplicity and the double standards. and how countries will want to engage and interact diplomatically to ensure that Germany does account and does become an accountable nation to either the Rome Statute or to its international obligations. And this is the difficulty that we are seeing. We're actually seeing the spreading out that the multilateral system is actually weakening because countries that have signed into these multilateral agreements and signed these treaties are not obliging and fulfilling their obligations that they need to be undertaking. So yes, I think they need to be called out. Germany needs to be called out. More than that, there needs to be other measures. There needs to be other kinds of political pressure imposed on Germany so that Germany can begin to start abiding with its international obligations. For instance, if you take the example of Germany, because of its historical past and where it has come from in terms of genocide and what has been committed in the past, it should have an obligation, just like South Africa, to ensure that Palestinians are not genocided, that they are not liquidated, which is currently the situation that is happening. Also on another level, like for instance, in South Africa, I wrote to our authorities immediately after those arrest warrants were issued out of the International Criminal Court. Of course, Israel made certain arguments because, it fell within their territorial jurisdiction, even though they're not a party to the Rome Statute. They were invited to make certain representations to the court. They made those representations and their arguments fell flat. Their arguments were not held to hold any weight. And also the question of jurisdiction was clarified that the ICC already made a decision earlier that it did have jurisdiction to investigate crimes that were being committed in the occupied Palestinian territories, both in the Gaza and the West Bank. So South Africa, as a party to the Rome Statute, did what it could. And in this instance, because we lodged a domestic criminal complaint and we had cited both locally based accused and internationally based accused, like Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, Smotrich, Golan May, and others, that Itamar, Ben-Gvir, that we're saying that, okay, if the ICC has issued arrest warrants for these two, now I'm requesting from the authorities to say that you give us an undertaking that you're going to invoke those arrest warrants. Make a statement at least to say we're invoking these arrest warrants. If these suspects decide to enter the territory of the Republic, they should be considered hostis humanus generis. That means enemy of all humankind. They are implicated in the worst kind of egregious crimes against humanity. That either we're going to arrest them and we're going to extradite them to the ICC, where an embodiment of a larger case is unfolding because a lot of complaints have been lodged against the Zionist entity, and there's a great deal of body of evidence that is sitting with the ICC. In this regard, I've also requested from our authorities, which is the National Prosecuting Authority of South Africa and South African Police Services, which is the Directorate of Priority Crimes Investigation, that the referral that we've made, the South African Zionist Terrorism Corridor Probe, the complaint that started in February 2022, that we've supplemented now in in July, where we lodged. And just now recently, we've identified two individuals. One individual, his name is called Aaron Bayhak. He's a South African individual that has been found to have served in an elite IDF sniper unit and has been conducting activities very close to the Al Nasser hospital. Prior to that, in the Tal Harwa district, there was also indications that near the Al Quds hospital that civilians were being targeted by this IDF unit. This IDF unit then went to, had moved closer to the Al Nasser hospital. And what had emanated from there was that he was kneel bent in a photo image next to another person called Daniel Raab from the United States, who was then interviewed by a Palestinian journalist called Yunus Tarawi, who gave a very detailed account of the geolocation of this unit.
Yes, and he's done great, amazing work.
Yes, and Yunus says that Palestinian civilians did not know that there was an IDF unit in the area because they were sniping off civilians from approximately 1,260 meters, 1.26 kilometers, which Palestinians thought was outside of any combat zone. And they were actually targeting indiscriminately between either fighters or Palestinian civilians. And this constitutes acts of terrorism. And there's a South African that is implicated. In fact, he came to South Africa and it was a very big situation, a big scene here, because he was exposed in a News 24 article, where I also provided comment on this in this article about South Africans going to illegally serve in violation of what we would call the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act and our other laws that says that you need specific authorization and approval before you can go and serve in the IDF or any other foreign military force. And there's very strong evidence here because this unit was geolocated to areas where the flower massacre happened in Gaza. It was geolocated to areas like the Al Nasser Hospital, geolocated to areas like the Tel Harwa district. There was also a preceding journalistic account of snipers in the area of the Al Quds Hospital. And we've seen what has happened. We've seen the number of civilians that have been persecuted, have been killed, and the mass graves that have been uncovered as well. So this clearly is part and parcel of the genocidal intent. Even when this individual, Daniel Raab, was interviewed, he spoke about Amalek, and he spoke about this historical biblical Amalek that must be fought against. And in this instance, the context of Amalek in current context of the situation is that Palestinians are the Amalek, and they need to be liquidated. They need to be destroyed. And that in itself, Kareem, is this kind of genocidal intent, this genocidal rhetoric that has come from the executive of the Israeli entity, of the Zionist entity, in terms of its command and control and executive structures, right down to the Israeli soldiers that are carrying out this kind of Amalek intent. And this falls squarely within the violations of the Genocide Convention that South Africa made extensive submissions about, that we have extended in terms of the Zionist terrorism corridor probe with genocide, as well as the inclusion of certain of South African individuals, nationals or citizens, who have violated either the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act, violated our ratification of the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court Act, institutions that have violated the prevention of organized crime, as well as violated the protection of constitutional democracy against terrorism and related activities. And that is the basis upon which our application and complaint has been sitting. But I want to add something very important. Following my visit from Tehran in 2017, there was also talk about an institutionalized legitimate campaign in terms of enabling laws to isolate Israel as a Zionist entity. And I initiated a project called IPSRA, which stands for the implementation and protection of Palestinian solidarity rights. It's an advocacy citizens bill, right? And it's a cumulative, all-cumulative initiative that deals with an institutionalized boycotts, divestment, sanctions campaign, as well as lawfare advocacy objectives in terms of initiating what you call a lawfare boycotts, divestments, and economics council, whereby there can be a campaign, a legitimized campaign from a national level, at government level, whereby you implement laws specifically to isolate and boycott Israel, as well as have an institutionalized campaign where you're seeing that immigration control has reconnaissance as well as surveillance on individuals that leave the country and come back into the country and are interrogated for what their activities have been. And this is to set consistently with other laws that I've just spoken about. So this is a lawfare advocacy project. It is a multifaceted but directed against the Zionist entity. We've been having challenges. So from the South African perspective, whilst things are appearing to happen on international level, on the domestic level, we've been seeing that there's a lack of will to look at IPSRA more definitively and say that lawfare advocacy is a specific policy objective of government to hold Israel accountable for war crimes committed with impunity, or, for instance, to hold even one South African Zionist Jewish youth that goes to serve that have violated the laws of this country. We haven't seen those prosecutions. We've done those criminal complaints, but we haven't seen those prosecutions. And that is the anomaly that we are facing at the moment, is that we want our government not only to walk the talk, right, when it comes to it at international level, but we want to see it at domestic level where there's physical prosecutions and there's institutionalized campaigns and laws specifically targeted against the Israeli entity.
So is it that you're seeing some local foot dragging regarding to the implementation that you're asking for, or is it just a matter of time before it's implemented?
I think it's foot dragging to an extent, but we must also be mindful that the Zionist lobbies and influences are very strong everywhere and anywhere globally. And we need to be constructively breaking those Zionist influences and lobbies down. The fact that we've not seen from 2008, 2009, a single South African physically prosecuted, right? Or intent, apart from what I've mentioned on the Khadija David's case, where they said they would invoke the arrest warrants that were issued out of Turkey. I'm yet to await for them to come back to me and say, Mr. Patel, you are right, that following our domestication of the Rome Statute, our referral, we were the state party that made a referral to the ICC. And the fact that the ICC has issued arrest warrants, that we are going to invoke those arrest warrants, whereby we're asking for Netanyahu and Gallant, if they enter the territory of the Republic, they will be extradited to the ICC. We will inform border control and issue a red alert in that regard, as well as inform Interpol that these are now fugitives from justice. And that kind of initiative is yet lacking, unfortunately. So, like we've had these problems elsewhere in the country, and yes, South Africa must be lauded for its for what it has done on international level. It still needs to walk the talk when it comes to it at the domestic level, where we are also fighting this battle against the Zionist entity and the forces, the Zionist forces that continue to lobby and have their influences in government. Remember, even in South Africa, we've had just not too long ago, we had a democratic election, and the African National Congress, the party of Nelson Mandela, did not get a majority, failed to get a majority government. So, we are in what you would call a government of national unity. And one of the political parties that's involved with, who's the second largest political party in this country, is called the Democratic Alliance. And the Democratic Alliance has very strong alliances to the Zionist lobbies and entities and US and European interests. And South Africa sits in a very unique situation because we have this, AGOA treaty between South Africa and the US, where we get preferential tariff rates for the exportation of our goods. We are also part of the World Trade Organization in terms of multilateral treaties for the free transfer of goods at certain tariffs in terms of the GATT and the GATS. And we've got very close associations with European countries. And then on the other hand, we're also part of the BRICS nations, which constitute Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which South Africa was a founding member. So we've got this dichotomy of interests where we've got a predominantly opposition party called the Democratic Alliance that has very strong Zionist influences and lobbies.
No, you were saying that that South Africa is in a very unique position, and I said yes, of course, because you're working towards a new multipolar world while also being part of the old one that is somewhat fading.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the fact I just got the Genocide Convention opened for your viewers and listeners as we were talking, and the fact that the Democratic Alliance, a political party in this country, because of its strong stance, and it's quite clear that those that are prosecuting the genocide, those that are protecting the actors and agents of this genocide, are not going to recognize and acknowledge that genocide is being perpetrated. But the facts on the ground, the de facto situation is what it is. Just recently, Amnesty International came out with an extensive report that Israel is involved in the perpetration of genocide. I just spoke about, if you just give me a moment, I just spoke about, I did talk to you about your colleagues from the Mayadeen
Yes.
network. I just want to go down and make reference to something that was very important by the United Nations Special Committee. This was crucial because this UN Special Committee came out with a very clear report. It said the following, and I want to read this. Israel's warfare methods in Gaza are genocidal, and starvation is used as a weapon of war. UN Special Committee report that was recently published says that Israel's warfare in Gaza is consistent with characteristics of genocide, with mass civilian casualties and life-threatening conditions intentionally imposed on Palestinians there. The Special Committee statement is incorporated with its damaging findings against Israel. Since the beginning of the war, Israeli officials have publicly supported policies that strip Palestinians of the very necessities required to sustain life: food, water, and fuel. The UN committee said these statements, along with the systematic and unlawful interference of humanitarian aid, make clear Israel's intent to instrumentalize life-saving supplies. Israel is intentionally causing death, starvation, and serious injury, using starvation as a method of war and inflicting collective punishment on the Palestinian committee. And just quickly further down, Israel's extensive bombing campaign in Gaza has decimated essential services and unleashed an environmental catastrophe that will have lasting health impacts. By early 2024, 25,000 tons of explosives, equivalent to 2 nuclear bombs, had been dropped on Gaza, causing massive destruction and the collapse of water and sanitation systems, agricultural devastation, and toxic pollution. By destroying vital water, sanitation, and food systems and contaminating the environment, Israel has created a lethal mix of crises that will inflict severe harm on generations to come. The Israelis' military use of AI, and this is very important because this has impacted on resistance and our resistance groups as well.
Sorry, yes, please go ahead.
The use of AI-assisted targeting with minimal human oversight, combined with heavy bombs, underscores Israel's disregard of its obligation to distinguish between civilians and combatants and take adequate safeguards to prevent civilian deaths. Amid the devastation in Gaza, Israel's escalating media censorship, suppression of dissent, and targeting of journalists are deliberate efforts to block global access to information, the committee found. It also noted how social media companies disproportionately remove pro-Palestinian content in comparison with posts inciting violence against Palestinians. The committee condemned the ongoing smear campaign and other attacks against UNRWA and the UN at large.
Please continue, but I just wanted to segue from that actually to a bit of background on your probe, because we never actually discussed the background of the probe and how it came to be.
Yes. So the background of the probe, I have given some historical context that we started off and initiated this probe. Initially, we did the Gaza docket in 2008, 2009. I was then involved with the Khadija David's case. 2014, the initial war, there was a war called Protective Aging in Gaza. And that was, I think, the beginning of the initiation of the probe. In 2016 as well, I went to the United Nations Human Rights Council and spoke about the ill treatment and persecution and torture of Palestinian prisoners. And from there on, what happened was initially started with one South African individual who was in Cape Town that served in the 2014 war, served in the IDF. And then we started collating further names of South African Zionists, impressionable Jewish youth that were either going to serve as lone soldiers in terms of a program in the IDF, and also there are mercenaries as well that go to serve and get compensated for their services, because Israel has to continue replenishing its, the IDF needs, the occupation forces needs to replenish its forces. So in February 2022, we then collated names of a number of individuals that went to serve in the 2014 war, and we made a case stating that they were violating the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act. This is a current piece of legislation that is active in our law. And it was supposed to be repealed by another law called the Prohibition of Mercenary Activities. However, that has not yet been enforced. So the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act speaks very clearly that any person or party that wants to go and render foreign military assistance to another army cannot be involved in any acts of terrorism. Obviously this impedes on regional peace and harmony, and that you need to make a formal application or you need to seek an authorization. This is done through the National Conventional Controls Arms Committee. The application is made to this committee, and a recommendation is then given to the Minister of Defense, who then makes a decision to either authorize the application or deny the application. Interestingly, Kareem, what we had done in November last year was we brought what you would call a promotion of access to information application to this National Conventional Controls Arms Committee. And we made, in this application the team made, we requested that there must be disclosure of all applications that were made in terms of this piece of legislation to the Arms Committee, where they've asked or requested permission to go and serve in the IDF, right? And this was done not only dating back to 2008, 2009, but dating back to 2006 when Israel invaded Lebanon, and the war in Lebanon ensued in 2006. So we dated back the application to try and identify if these Zionists had made any application in terms of our law. And we received a response back, and you'll be shocked by what the response was. The response was very clear to say the National Conventional Controls Arms Committee, dating back from 2006 to November 2023, did not receive even a single application by any Zionist institution or Zionist soldier to go and serve in the IDF or the Israeli occupation forces. So what did this? This confirmed our prima facie view that we don't think that any of them had ever complied with our national legislation. And getting back this response, which is part and parcel of our complaint, is that we bring this complaint, we raise this to say, here's the National Conventional Controls Arms Committee by their own letter and by their own representation stating that not a single Zionist had applied. So they were actually already in violation of the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act. And if any of those accused were found in the territory of the country, they needed then to be arrested and prosecuted under the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act in terms of payment of either a fine or imprisonment or both. So this is the double standard that I'm talking about, is that whilst we're seeing the great work that's happening on the international level, is that the government statements, the statements by former ministers like Naledi Pandor and other statements by our president, is not actually being an action. It's not being actioned out at domestic level, because we have not seen, we know for a fact that there are Zionists that went to serve in Gaza, have committed crimes in Gaza, and have come back to our territory and have not been either arrested, interrogated, or prosecuted. And then the question begs is why? And it has to come back to the political influences, the political will and the lobbies, the Zionist lobbies, and what will it cost the state when you make such decisions to actually prosecute, and how will it cost you and in what levels, what economic agreements, what trade agreements are you going to sacrifice, how is America going to punish you as a country? We're a small country in contrast to the US. We have trade agreements with the US. Already there was at a certain time when South Africa was involved in the ICJ application, there was talk about the retraction of our AGOA, beneficial trade export tariffs to the US. So all of these, tools are then used, economic tools are used against you. And obviously this then punishes your population because you've taken a stance against the Zionist entity. So South Africa is part and parcel of the greater, this greater influence of Zionist lobbies and political interference. And unfortunately, this impedes and impacts on the rule of law. The fact that I was talking about the Democratic Alliance speaks about constitutional democracy and adherence to our country and its intention to upholding the rule of law, but very clearly doesn't make a statement. I mean, for instance, Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, what does it say? It says genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The following acts shall be punishable: genocide, right? That's actually being perpetrated, genocide. What is it, I'm asking you, in terms of Article 2 from subsection A to subsection E, what is it that the Zionists have not doing when it comes to the perpetration of crimes and genocide? They are responsible and culpable for all those elements of what.
And as we said in the introduction to the probe, this is the definition of what Ilan Pape has termed to be incremental genocide.
And even further in incremental genocide. Now we've actually moved from Ilan Pape's definition of incremental genocide, which has been happening over a period of time, to actual perpetration of genocide. Now, what acts of genocide become punishable? Article 3 speaks about genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide. That could include European countries, which we know have been licensing huge volumes of arms from Israel. And in fact, I made a statement about this when we did a protest, and I handed a memorandum to the US consulate in 2017, where we spoke about Mohrabi, who was from Amnesty International at the time, and said that huge volumes of arms are being licensed by European countries from Israel. And in fact, cynically, those arms that get licensed to be used in Europe and other countries get battle tested in the West Bank and in the occupied Palestinian territories. And that is the cynicism behind what this whole global military industrial complex, which we focused a lot in 2022 about, is committing, and part and parcel with bankers, financiers, politicians, corrupt politicians, in propping up and maintaining the Zionist entity to violate and contravene the Genocide Convention. And this is where they become responsible for acts of genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempts to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. And that includes contracting parties. The contracting parties undertake to enact in accordance with their respective constitutions. And this is important because it came back to your question. And this is Article 5 that says contracting parties undertake to enact in accordance with their respective constitutions the necessary legislation to give effect to the provisions of the present convention, and in particular to provide effective penalties for persons guilty of genocide or any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3. And that is critical because if the UN Security Council is not acting and you are party to the Rome Statute, and as I've mentioned, that South Africa had an obligation to prevent the commission of genocide, that you can create laws within your own country, like I spoke about the IPSRA advocacy bill. Create laws in your own country, become part and parcel of regional treaties and agreements with other like-minded countries in isolating Israel and having the intent to prosecute the perpetrators of genocide because you've signed the Genocide Convention, or take active measures in terms of a military army or a safe military corridor to ensure that humanitarian aid gets into Gaza, that civilian populations are protected. You don't need the UN to do that. You can do that if you have the political will in those regions to say that we are going to safeguard, protect our brethren. The people in Gaza are our brethren. They are our brothers. They are our sisters. When I see a child that is killed in Gaza, it's my child. When I see a sister's dignity, she is indignified and her dignity is stripped away, it is my sister. It is my mother. And that is the Muslim Ummah. That is the point of the Muslim Ummah that we need to get to. That is the point of not only considering what is the international legal multilateral system, but where have we acted as the Muslim Ummah in preventing this kind of genocide? And we've seen this with certain countries that have undertaken the axis of resistance. We've seen that in Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, our martyr, our beloved martyr, that has made the stance and taken the stance and led and given his life for Gaza and given his life for Al-Quds. And this is what we need to be doing, is educating our population, our Muslim people, to say, we're not interested in the sectarianism. We don't want to be sectarianly divided, which plays into the hands of the Zionist entities and into the US and the European countries, that we reject sectarianism. Even what's unfolding in Syria, we must be very clear to say that we reject sectarianism, that we are part and parcel of one Ummah, and that if one part of the Ummah is hurting, the entire Ummah is hurting, and that we need to come together and we need to struggle and fight for the liberation of occupied Palestine and for the liberation of our lands in the region, which is being controlled and influenced by all these entities that are extracting our resources, wanting to balkanize our states, weaken our states at governmental level, having our own Muslim brethren fight against each other, weaken ourselves, and they are extracting our resources at a very minimal rate, and they are benefiting their own countries. And this is my message, is that we need to be aware of the situation, that why can't Muslim countries come together, and like-minded countries come together and say, we're going to be not only taking acts of resistance, because we believe that Palestinians have the right of self-determination, but also we are going to be implementing the Genocide Convention. We are going to be looking at laws and legal frameworks within our own countries to strengthen the Genocide Convention, so that if there's intractability at the United Nations level and the Security Council, we can be doing our part in terms of enforcement at the local level. And this is exactly the work that we do in terms of lawfare advocacy. The IPSRA Advocacy Citizens Bill, the South African Zionist Terrorism Corridor Probe, holding Zionist Jewish youth accountable for crimes being committed, violating our laws. We work quite closely with countries like Canada, who also have what you call the Foreign Enlistment Act, where a lot of Canadian Jewish youth go to serve in the IDF. For instance, Karim, just recently, we've included it in our executive summary, and I ask you to please go through it properly, educate your viewers and your listeners about it. In Canada, there was also an initiative by the revenue services to strip the Canadian Jewish National Fund of its tax exemption and benefit status, where if you were contributing to the Jewish National Fund, then you were given a tax exemption, or you were granted certain credits on terms of your tax liability, because it was found that the Jewish National Fund in Canada, its funding was related to making payments and funding the IDF infrastructure. We've raised a case against the Jewish National Fund in terms of the KKL program, where they've used the absenteeism law in occupied Palestinian territories and in neighborhoods, where Palestinians were not allowed to come back to their properties and to their land. And then those properties were then purchased by Israeli settlers through this JNF KKL program. And how ownership was then transferred illegally and unlawfully from Palestinians not allowed to come back to their land. The land was then confiscated by the state, by the Israeli regime, and resold to Israeli settlers. And they then took over the land. And how was it funded? Funded through the JNF, through this global network terrorism institutions that raised these funds, greenwash forests, Palestinian forests that are, or Palestinian neighborhoods and Palestinian land, and then, they make forests and they make other, provided now to settlers that have now settled on Palestinian land. So that is an extremely important point, because it comes back to UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which clearly states that any form of, that there cannot be a violation or impediment on the 1967 borders, and any impediment is unlawful It's unlawful under international law, and those settlements need to be dismantled. In fact, it went so far as UN rapporteurs saying that this constitution, in violation of UN Security Council 2334, and the impediment and the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements constitutes war crimes. So it's a systemic operation whitewashing their crimes or greenwashing their crimes in making forests of Palestinian land, destroying the olive trees, the olive plantations, as well as we must show the hypocrisy. There's a huge hypocrisy when our sisters of Palestine are indignified, when they are raped, when they are stripped of their dignity, when their children are being killed. As Muslims, where do we stand in standing for the justice of our women, right? And then where are the equality groups? Where are the feminist groups? Where are the women's rights groups? We need to be asking, where are those women's rights groups? There's democratic rights, right? They talk about women's rights. And at the moment a woman is not dressed in accordance with the Western standard, then they are being persecuted, or their culture is persecuting their rights. When these Zionist entities and these Zionists are persecuting our women, are raping our women, we've got videos, images that we have provided. There's an Al Jazeera documentary that very clearly showed how Zionist soldiers and Zionists went into the homes of Palestinians in Gaza, into the bedrooms of Palestinian women, and were wearing the underwear of our women, devaluing our women to that level, right? And exposing this genocidal and this inhumane manner in how they conduct themselves, to the extent that they were having TikTok videos that children, Israeli children, were what you would call mimicking children of Gaza that were bleeding, the aftershocks of the bombs that were after the bomb blast, and the Palestinian children were shaking, that these Israeli children were mimicking and in a way of humiliating our children for for the aftershocks and pouring tomato sauce and doing other things to humiliate the suffering that Palestinians are enduring, which is completely unacceptable. I mentioned earlier that how much tons of ammunition, how many tons of bombs were unleashed in Gaza, and the destruction of the environment. The fact that when they attacked Hassan Nasrallah, around him 6 apartment blocks, if I recall, were destroyed. Every living existence within the perimeter of where Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was targeted and assassinated, which was an act of terrorism. Okay?
Used 82 on that attack alone.
That attack alone. And you look at the environmental impact. Now you've got all these environmental summits that go on about green energy and reducing the carbon footprint and the fossil fuel and moving over to a more greener environment because of global warming. It's a contradiction and a duplicity in terms when this global military industrial complex is allowed to supply its so-called weapons of defense, which are actually weapons of aggression against defenseless civilian population in their environments, decimating their environments. It's a contradiction to the environmental initiatives that these same countries go and advocate against. I mean, I do environmental law, so I'm telling you about this. That this is a contradiction of terms in terms of the environment. That why is the treatment of Gaza and what happens to the environment of Gaza differentiated from the environments elsewhere in the world? Is not your bombs that you're unleashing in Gaza contributing to global warming of our planet? So yes, on a level, we need to be moving away from arms and munitions. We need to be moving towards a safer, more just, and politically tolerant societies. But this can only happen when oppression is defeated. And until oppression is not defeated, we need to continue and persist in our struggles in all avenues, avenues of resistance, avenues of the right of self-determination, avenues of protecting the integrity of the sovereignty and territorial sovereignty of our lands and countries, protecting the dignity and equality of our people and our brethren and our sisters and our children, their right to life and equality, and the right to life and fundamental human rights are protected of our innocent civilian population. Those responsibilities and onus lies on us. And we must be using the international multilateral system. And where that is failing us, we must be forcing our governments to provide laws in holding those countries to account, as well as the initiatives that we've unfolded in terms of IPSRA that I spoke about, as well as the laws of domesticating laws like the Rome Statute, as well as creating multilateral or regional agreements with like-minded countries to hold war tribunals, to hold the Zionists accountable, as well as the terrorism corridor probe, where we extended it into genocide, and showing the duplicity of these countries and these individuals that talk about one thing but completely are aggressive in another way.
Mr. Patel, I wholeheartedly thank you. I mean, it was just supposed to be a one-hour interview, and I've enjoyed your talk so much, and there's so much more we could say, but unfortunately, it's an hour and a half now. There's so much to unpack here. There's so much information. I really want to thank you very, very much for the time you've given us, and hopefully we can have another talk, a follow-up talk to this. Thank you so much for your time.
Sure. Thank you, Kareem. Thank you for the invitation. I'm truly honored for the invitation. I am available and open in the course of next year. I would suggest, read through the executive summary. There are many different elements, and the extent of crimes is so extensive that what we've called it is a microcosm of the greater situation of crimes that are being perpetrated against the Palestinian people. I've raised, we've raised a few incidents and testimonies which are extremely tragic. The story of the young girl in Rajab that was killed, yes. And how she was, there was a call to the Red Crescent Society, and they were on their way, stood against these occupying forces and entities. And we must continue the struggle, inshallah, because that is our obligation. This is our religious obligation. This is our religious injunction, that we must ensure that our lands are liberated, that our children are liberated, that the dignity of our women are restored, that we will refuse to be colonized. We will refuse secular colonialism. We will refuse all these ideals that are put onto us by other standards that we must succumb to, and that we must become subjugated, and our generations of children to come must be subjugated to this oppression. It is our responsibility. It is a responsibility of us following in the footsteps of Imam Hussein at Karbala, in the struggles that he had endured against oppression, that we must fight against this oppression, all means necessary, until we are liberated, because that is our responsibility during the life of our times, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you again. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon, and inshallah we'll have a follow-up meeting if God wills it.
Shukran. Shukran jazeelan, and thank you for the invitation. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.